Now I would like to ask Mr. Marek Bartelik, President of AICA International, to speak. And when we started to design the Congress theme, I met Marek, and he told me we spoke about responsibility. He told me that Eastern Europe had a special historical role, and I don't know what Marek will now tell you about, but I started to think about our position and about our responsibilities, and all this day will be focused on this region and its reception. So I'm really glad that Marek can now start, and afterwards I will introduce you as moderators of the day, and we'll start then with a speech of Mr. Piotr Piotrowski. So, Marek.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Juraj. Can you hear me? Yeah, now. Okay. Well, I guess before we go to space, I would like to take you down to Earth and maybe talk about sort of certain aspects of this discussion that I would like to hear, and we'll see how things go. As I mentioned already in my earlier remarks, this is very special for me to be here because I was born in the region, and I guess when we had the conversation with Juraj, the special aspect of this region for me was in part because that's where I come from, but also from the fact that what I guess Marjorie mentioned, that with the changes, political, and I guess with political there were economic and also cultural changes, what happened that it created sort of an opportunity for the countries that, or for the nations, or for the people who live here to sort of reinvent themselves in some way. And I think we had huge expectations about these changes, and we probably will hear a lot about whether those expectations are realized, or they are still expectations, or where we are going, as I said, about 25 years after the change of the late 1980s and early 1990s. I prepared a short presentation. As I said, it's kind of almost like a wish list, what I hope we will be hearing here, we'll be discussing here, but of course the discussion will take its natural kind of turn, and I'm sure it will be very excited. So as we all, I'm very excited about being here and listening to all the participants. We have a terrific group of keynote speakers. We have wonderful participants. The Getty Foundation has been mentioned several times. We are incredibly grateful to them for supporting us for a number of years now, and I hope will continue. And of course, UNESCO, it's our umbrella kind of organization. And then we are delighted to have such a support from the Slovak colleagues and from the authorities and so on. I think it's incredible that Košice is the European capital of, the cultural capital of Europe. I know that there are many things going on, so we are just part of this wonderful year that you have. I'm going to read my text because I think it will be easier. So, well, as has been mentioned already, there was a Congress in the region in 1966 when it was still Czechoslovakia. I mentioned it again. Last time we ventured into this part of the world was in 2005 when we had our Congress in Ljubljana in Slovenia. And that was a very interesting moment because if I remember well, I just Googled this, so maybe I could make a mistake. It was just 1 year after Slovenia joined the European Union. So this was kind of a symbolic moment, I guess, for that country, but also a transition that you all kind of people living in this region experience, and it became part of your new reality. I was joking that in some way you left one union and you joined another union. So since the fall of the Berlin Wall over 2 decades ago, the region has been rapidly developing in all aspects of life, including its remarkable cultures and arts. With the changes came challenges. Many countries in the region have struggled to preserve their unique artistic identity in the age of globalization. As we know well, these changes have also made an impact on the practice of art criticism, which is increasingly becoming, as the American critic Peter Plagans observed, a subdivision of the entertainment industry. Paradoxically enough, the situation has exposed the gap between the so-called art world and the rest of the world, and especially what the rest of the world think art is, or appears to be, or should be, although both worlds might agree that it increasingly looks like a form of entertainment. The title of this Congress, White Places, Black Holes, as enigmatic as it is, conveys well the essence of planned discussions, and I'm quoting from the statement that was made by the organizers, to analyze the strategies by which lesser-known regions have been and are reflected in the global history of art. While focusing on Central Europe, a geocultural construct that has replaced the geopolitical construct, Eastern Europe. This new designation reflects the specificity of the region, and reflects the specificity of the region first by putting in a context of a long view of history, and second by stressing its cultural diversity in the past and in the present, and I would add also in our memory. I very much look forward to hearing more about this aspect of multicultural kind of long view of history and shorter view of history, and how it applies to what's happening in this region. The transformations of Central and Eastern Europe since the fall of the Berlin Wall have been remarkable. We can see them everywhere. They are visible in the urban and rural fabric of many places, including here in Košice, this year's European capital of culture. Of course, we can also see the painful remnants of the past, including those left by the previous political system. As I wrote these words, I remind myself not to call it generically communism, and I refer to the system, the political system here, because this term does not accurately describe the political system in the region before 1990, which obviously was not entirely homogeneous, although it was presented as such by the rhetoric of the Cold War. As we know, after the Second World War, some countries became more communist than others. For example, former Yugoslavia was less communist than, let's say, East Germany or Bulgaria. Many discussions on this slippery topic have been already taken place. Here are some questions that that persist. Where, if at all, should we look for commonality of artistic expression in the context of the politics of the region? Can we talk about a specific brand of art criticism here and its relationship to specific ideology or ideologies? How should these questions be perceived in the context of the Balkanization of Europe? I look forward to hearing more about this too during our debates here. I think one of the common misconceptions about Eastern Europe, and I put it in quotation marks, was that there was a pervasive cultural uniformity throughout its borders because it was controlled by the same oppressive political system. However, viewed from inside and sometimes from abroad as well, this image of Eastern Europe was misleading and historically shaky. We may need to talk here about a political reality, but also about political mythologies. cultural speaking, Poland has as little in common with Bulgaria or even with Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic nowadays as France has with Portugal or Belgium. In fact, because of the tumultuous history of the region, each country in it developed a distinct culture, or rather multiple cultures, and did everything it could to maintain their national and regional distinctions. Moreover, each one had different ways of interacting with their neighbors and the world at large. If we take Slovakia as an example, its modern culture and arts were involved in a constant triangulation. Slovak, Czech, the rest of the world, perhaps with the emphasis on the West when we think about the rest of the world. In establishing networks of communication, artists from a given country, be it Slovakia or the Czech Republic or Poland or Bulgaria, often had much stronger contacts with their colleagues in the West than with those in the neighboring Soviet bloc countries. And I would say this situation was perhaps somewhat different when it comes to contemporary art because its dissemination, a process which was rather dynamic in itself, was largely controlled by the state, although there was, as we know, a second kind of unofficial network of relationships and art kind of network. But here again, we can say that some scenes were more open or free than others. For example, in the 1970s, the former Yugoslavia and Poland produced very vital art scenes, and many artists from the region actually participated actively in international art events, and I would say even on a regular basis. Inside the countries under the Soviet influence, because that's how sometimes we describe them, the situation of artists and critics had its own specificity, which had already been analyzed, focusing, for example, on the distinction between dissidents and collaborators, which were often blurred. And one might recall Miklos Haraszti's book called The Velvet Prison, Artists Under State Socialism, or an earlier book by Czesław Miłosz, The Captive Mind, a sharp assessment of the allure of Stalinism among intellectuals in post-war Central and Eastern Europe, which, when Miłosz wrote it in exile, he said that he wrote it under great inner conflict. In this context, we might talk about a trauma rather than about sort of political, cultural situation, and this trauma, because that's in fact what we must talk about, has been familiar to people living in other parts of the world under harsh political and economic conditions. So I very much look forward to hearing about this subject from our speakers who come from other regions of the world and who can sort of share the experience of, you know, what this kind of living under totalitarian kind of conditions due to practice of making art and also to art criticism. The political and economic unrest in the late 1970s and in the 1980s, which ultimately led to the collapse of the system here, the political system and economic system, if we can speak about an economic system in those terms, resulted in a massive departure of many East Europeans to the West. As a young student, I was part of that immigration. Living in Paris, Berlin, or New York, we confronted what the Czech writer Milan Kundera called the unbearable lightness of being. That is a situation when we were living in the so-called free world, but remained emotionally and psychologically connected to the world, which was described often as behind the Iron Curtain. We also started to discover the complexities of living in a world that describes itself as democratic. We became critical in a particular way beyond the politics of the Cold War, and I shall add also beyond narrow nationalism. In my opinion, these transformations of the region, the transformations of this region cannot be fully examined and understood without taking into consideration the fate of exiled East Europeans, artists and critics among them, and their input into understanding the complexities of the world we live in. This perspective is particularly important because throughout most of the 1980s, Eastern Europe remained hidden from our view outside of the region. As a result, we experience life there indirectly, almost, although dramatically, and I would say trauma blended with nostalgia, the past produced its memory. Needless to say, the region, the identity of the people living here was already undergoing, or not already, but was constantly undergoing serious transformations before that fact became apparent to the rest of the world. And these changes, of course, included significant transformations in art and culture. I'm jumping in time again just to sort of map the situation of the last, since the collapse of the Berlin Wall, perhaps anticipating important angles of our discussion. For Eastern Europe, the 1990s was a period of transition, which resulted in a blossoming of the local art scenes. The world found out that this area was very rich in artistic talent, and soon artists from Romania, Serbia, Slovakia, and other countries became the regular participants in the major artistic events, showing in museums and galleries around the world. These artists both distinguished themselves from and blended with other artists from other parts of the world, becoming sort of part of a global phenomenon. So we may say that the situation became quote-unquote normal. But normalcy can be also highly challenging. So if one expected the art from the region to be different, to contribute something unique to the universal artistic language or initiate new discussions relevant to our time and to us all, one might not find this happen. Perhaps I should not talk about the universal language sort of as a formal category, but rather link it to the identity of the artist as a participant in vital cultural and artistic exchanges. Here, in my opinion, most of the artists from the region simply blended with the rest of the world as they comfortably embraced the culture industry, especially that in the West. And so far as as far as I know, there is no Hans Haki coming from the region. As we celebrate the new freedom in this part of the world, and at the same time notice growing conservatism and even xenophobia among its citizens, we must address this subject here as well. And I consider myself an art critic, but also I'm a poet, so I would like to finish this sketchy presentation by quoting the great Konstantis Kavafi, the Greek poet, and I think this is about us all, not just people from the region, but perhaps all of us. So here is his famous poem, which talks about the barbarians. So what are we waiting for? Assembling in this forum. The barbarians are to arrive today. Why has there suddenly begun all this commotion and this confusion? How sullen people's faces have become? Why are the streets and the squares emptying so swiftly, and everyone is returning home in deep preoccupation? Because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come. And some people arrived from the frontiers and said that there are no barbarians anymore. And now, what will become of us without barbarians? Those peoples were sort of a solution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marek.